In the harsh Montana winter, a pregnant woman named Mara Ellison collapses in the snow, fleeing a violent past and carrying an unborn child. Her stagecoach has overturned, leaving her alone and dying in the blizzard. She's running from a man who once owned her, determined to give her baby a different life. James Callahan, a widowed rancher living in solitude, finds Mara nearly frozen at his property's edge. This gentle soul has been haunted by his own losses, his home silent for years. He brings her inside, nursing her back to health by his warm kitchen fire. What starts as simple rescue grows into something profound. Mara brings life back to James's quiet world, while he offers her the safety she's never known. Through long winter evenings, they share stories and slowly build trust based on choice, not desperation. When spring arrives, Mara faces an impossible decision: disappear again to protect her child, or accept James's tender proposal of marriage, built on genuine affection. But what happens when her violent past finally catches up to their peaceful ranch? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana plains, driving snow horizontal through the air with such force that James Callahan could barely see his own boots as he made his evening rounds. At 42, he'd weathered enough blizzards to know this one would be remembered, the kind that old-timers would reference for years to come. He pulled his wool coat tighter and pressed forward toward the barn, his lantern casting dancing shadows that disappeared as quickly as they formed. It was then he saw her, a dark shape crumpled against the fence post where his property met the endless expanse of wilderness. At first, he thought it might be a fallen calf, but as he drew closer, his heart lurched. The shape was too long, too human. James broke into an awkward run through the knee-deep snow, his boots slipping on the hidden ice beneath. She lay motionless, her dark hair spread like spilled ink across the white ground. Her clothes were fine, too fine for these parts, but torn and soaked through. Even in the dim lantern light, he could see her lips had turned blue, and her breathing came in shallow, barely perceptible puffs of vapor. But it was the swell of her belly beneath her torn coat that made his hands shake as he knelt beside her. "Ma'am?" His voice was rusty from disuse, gentler than he'd spoken in the 3 years since Margaret's passing. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds. For a moment, terror flashed across her features, and she tried to pull away from his touch. "Easy now," James murmured, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "You're safe. I'm going to get you inside." Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her condition. She couldn't be more than 25, he guessed, with delicate features that spoke of a genteel upbringing. What was a woman like this doing alone in a Montana blizzard? The trek back to his cabin felt endless. Each step was a battle against the wind, and he found himself talking to her unconscious form, partly to keep himself focused, and partly because the silence of his home had grown too familiar over the years. Almost there now. Got a good fire. Going, and the coffee's still warm. Margaret always said I made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, but I suppose that's what you need out here. His cabin stood solid against the storm, windows glowing with the promise of warmth. James had built it himself 15 years ago, back when he'd believed it would be filled with children's laughter and Margaret's singing. Now it housed only memories and the echo of his own footsteps. He kicked the door open and carried her straight to the bedroom, his and Margaret's room, though he'd been sleeping in the spare room since she passed. The bed still held Margaret's quilts, the ones she'd stitched during the long winter evenings, and he felt a strange comfort laying this stranger among them. Working with the efficiency of a man who'd tended to injured animals and workers, James began the careful process of warming her. He removed her soaked outer garments with respectful haste, his eyes averted, wrapping her in dry blankets and building up the fire until the room glowed with heat. On the nightstand sat Margaret's most precious possession, her wedding ring. the simple gold band he'd placed on her finger 20 years ago. He'd kept it there since the day she died, unable to put it away, but unable to look at it without feeling the hollow ache in his chest. Tonight, for the first time, it seemed less like a monument to loss and more like a reminder of what love could build. The woman stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips. James dampened a cloth with warm water and gently cleaned the dirt and snow from her face, revealing skin pale as porcelain. Her hands, he noticed, bore no wedding ring, though calluses on her palms suggested she wasn't the pampered lady her clothes implied. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from cold and exhaustion. "You're in my home," James said softly, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Name's James Callahan. You collapsed near my property line. Do you remember what happened?" Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, and relief flickered across her features when she felt the familiar weight there. Then fear crept back in, and she struggled to sit up. "Easy," James said, gently pressing her back down. "You and the baby are safe. Nothing's going to harm you here." Something in his tone must have reached her, because she relaxed slightly, though. Her eyes remained watchful. "The stagecoach," she whispered. "It overturned. The others. I don't know what happened to the others." James nodded grimly. He'd heard no word of any overturned coach, but in weather like this, it might be days before anyone found the wreckage. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, and in that pause, he sensed a story far more complicated than a simple travel mishap. "Mara," she finally said. "Mara Ellison." Dawn broke grey and silent over the Callahan ranch, the blizzard having finally exhausted itself during the night. James had dozed fitfully in the chair beside the bed, startling awake whenever Mara stirred, or when the wind rattled the windows. Now, in the pale morning light filtering through frost-covered glass, he could see her more clearly. She was beautiful in a fragile way, like a piece of fine china that had been carefully mended after breaking. Her dark hair spread across Margaret's pillow, and her face, though still pale, had lost the waxy pallor of near death. The rise and fall of her breathing was steady now, and he offered a quiet prayer of gratitude. James rose stiffly from the chair, his joints protesting the night's vigil. He needed coffee and food, for both of them. As he turned toward the door, her voice stopped him. "You stayed." The words were soft, tinged with wonder. He turned back to find her watching him with those storm-colored eyes, alert now and taking in every detail of the room. Her gaze lingered on Margaret's belongings, the hairbrush on the dresser, the faded photograph of a younger James with his arm around a smiling woman. "Course I stayed," James said simply. "Couldn't leave you alone, not in your condition." Mara's hand moved to her belly again, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as instinctive protection. "How far along are you?" he asked gently. 7 months, maybe 8. Her voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested she hadn't had proper medical care. "The baby. Is everything all right?" James moved closer, his manner gentle but confident. Years of helping birth foals and calves had taught him to read the signs. "Far as I can tell, yes. But you were near frozen when I found you. Another hour out there." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between them. Mara closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, he saw tears, threatening to spill over. "Thank you," she whispered. I can't." She struggled to find words adequate for the gift of life itself. "No need for thanks," James said, uncomfortable with gratitude. Any decent person would have done the same. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. There had been a choice in bringing her into his private sanctuary, into the room where he'd loved and lost, into the space that held his most precious memories. Yet it had felt as natural as breathing. Mara tried to sit up, wincing as her muscles protested. James was beside her in an instant, supporting her with strong, gentle hands. "Slow now. You've been through an ordeal. I need to." She looked toward the door, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "There's a chamber pot under the bed," James said matter-of-factly, then tactfully withdrew. "I'll get some breakfast started. Take your time." In the kitchen, James moved with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to caring for himself. He built up the fire in the stove and put coffee on to boil, the familiar routine soothing his nerves. On the scarred wooden table sat a leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. He'd noticed it among Mara's few possessions, when he'd removed her wet clothes and had set it by the fire to dry. The journal fell open to a page dated just weeks ago, and though he didn't mean to pry, his eyes caught a few lines written in Mara's careful script. "If I don't make it, if something happens to me, I pray someone will love this child the way I already do. I pray they'll understand that sometimes running toward an uncertain future is the only way to escape a certain hell." James closed the journal quickly, his heart constricting. Whatever had driven her out into that blizzard, whatever she was running from, it was bad enough that she'd risked her life and her unborn child's life to escape it. When Mara emerged from the bedroom, she'd managed to braid her hair and smooth her rumpled dress. She moved carefully, one hand supporting her back, the other pressed protectively over her belly. James had seen that same posture in expectant mares, the instinctive grace of a creature carrying precious cargo. "I have eggs and bacon," he offered, pulling out a chair for her at the kitchen table, "and bread that's only a day old." "You're very kind," she said, settling into the chair with a soft sigh of relief. "But I should be on my way soon." "I don't want to impose. Where exactly do you plan to go?" James asked, not unkindly. "The nearest town is 30 miles, and there won't be a stage running for days after this storm." Mara's face crumpled slightly, and for the first time he saw the full weight of her desperation. I don't know. Somewhere. Anywhere that's not—" She stopped herself, but not before he caught the flash of fear in her eyes. James cracked eggs into the skillet, the sizzle filling the sudden silence. "Well," he said finally, "seems to me you and that baby need proper rest and proper food before you go anywhere, storm or no storm." He set a plate before her, eggs cooked just until the whites were set, bacon crisp, and thick slices of bread, still warm from the oven. Mara stared at the food as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" James asked, settling across from her with his own plate. It's been a while." She took a tentative bite, then another, and he watched some of the tension leave her shoulders as the warm food settled in her stomach. 3 days passed in a rhythm as gentle and steady as breathing. Mara found herself settling into the quiet cadence of ranch life, though she remained poised to flee at the first sign of danger. James, for his part, moved through his daily routines with a lightness he hadn't felt in years, as if the simple presence of another soul had awakened something in him that had been dormant too long. Each morning he would rise before dawn to tend the animals, returning to find Mara already awake, sitting by the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. She never spoke of her past during these quiet moments, but James began to read the subtle signs of her healing, the way her shoulders gradually relaxed, how her startled responses to unexpected sounds grew less frequent. "The mountains are beautiful," she said on the third morning, her breath fogging the window glass. "I've never seen anything like them." "Been here all my life," James replied, setting down a pail of fresh milk. "Sometimes forget how they might look to someone seeing them fresh." "Where did you come from?" he asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. It was the first personal question he'd ventured since that first night. Mara's fingers tightened. Around her cup. "Back east, Philadelphia originally." She paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "My father was a lawyer. We had a comfortable life." The way she said it told James there was much more to the story. "What brought you out here?" A shadow crossed her features. "Poor choices. Trust given to the wrong person." Her hand moved to her belly. "I thought I was making a good marriage. Turns out some men see wives as property to be owned rather than partners to be cherished." James felt a familiar anger stir in his chest, the same righteous fury he'd felt years ago when, He'd seen men mistreat their horses or abuse their power over those weaker than themselves. "Not all men think that way," he said quietly. "No," Mara agreed, meeting his eyes. "I'm beginning to understand that." That afternoon, James disappeared into his workshop, a lean-to structure attached to the barn where he kept his woodworking tools. Mara could hear the steady rhythm of his plane, smoothing wood, punctuated by the occasional rasp of sandpaper. When she asked what he was working on, he'd only smiled mysteriously and suggested she rest. But Mara had grown restless with inactivity. Despite her condition, she was accustomed to keeping busy, and the enforced idleness chafed at her. She began by tidying the kitchen, then moved on to organizing the pantry shelves. James protested mildly when he found her scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees. "You don't need to be doing that," he said, gently helping her to her feet. "You're a guest here. I need to feel useful," Mara replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've never been one to sit idle, and your kindness doesn't mean I should become a burden." "You're not a burden," James said firmly, "but if you need something to do, there's mending in that basket there. Been putting it off for months." That evening, as snow began falling again in fat, lazy flakes, they sat by the fire, James reading an old copy of Dickens, while Mara worked on darning his socks. The domestic scene felt both strange and natural, as if they were playing house, but with an underlying current of real affection developing between them. "You read well," Mara observed, listening to the cadence of his voice as he read aloud. Most men out here didn't have a school teacher for a wife," James said with a gentle smile. "Margaret insisted on improving my education, said a man should be able to discuss more than cattle prices and weather. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. James closed the book, running his fingers over the worn cover. "Lost her to pneumonia 3 winters ago. Thought for a while I might follow her, if you understand my meaning." Mara set down her mending and looked at him with new understanding. "What changed your mind?" "Time, mostly, and realizing that giving up wouldn't honor what we'd built together. Margaret always said life was meant to be lived, not just endured." "I'm sorry for your loss," Mara said softly, "but I'm grateful you chose to keep living. Otherwise—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood. If James had given in to his grief, he wouldn't have been there to find her in the snow. The next morning, James presented her with his project, a wooden cradle, simple but beautifully crafted, the wood sanded, smooth as silk and glowing with a coat of beeswax. The sight of it brought tears to Mara's eyes. "James, I can't. This is too much." "Every baby needs a proper place to sleep," he said simply, though she could see the pride and pleasure in his work shining in his eyes. Figured it was better to be prepared. Mara ran her hands over the curved rails, marveling at the craftsmanship. In the cradle's smooth wood, she saw more than just a sleeping place for her child. She saw hope, planning for a future, acceptance of her place in his world, at least temporarily. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." That night she wrote in her journal by lamplight, "Today, a man I barely know showed me more kindness than I received in 5 years of marriage. He's building a cradle for my child, not because he has to, not because he expects anything in return, but simply because it's the right thing to do. I'm beginning to believe that goodness might not be as rare as I'd thought. I'm beginning to believe that safety might be more than just a dream." As she closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Mara allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to stay, to build a life in this quiet place with this gentle man, to let her child grow up knowing the security of unconditional love and acceptance. But even as the dream took shape in her mind, the shadow of her past loomed large. Silas Blackwood was not a man to give up what he considered his property, and until she was certain he could never find her, she couldn't risk bringing danger to this peaceful sanctuary. The morning started like any other. James was in the barn mucking stalls when he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Mail delivery was sporadic during winter, but Tom Bradley, the postal rider, was known for his determination to complete his routes regardless of weather. "Morning, James," Tom called out, his breath visible in the crisp air as he reined in his horse near the porch. "Got some letters for you. One looks official-like." James wiped his hands on his work pants and walked over to collect the small bundle of correspondence. Most of it was the usual: seed catalogues, a letter from his sister in Denver, and what appeared to be a notice from the territorial government. But it was the fourth piece that made his blood run cold. The envelope was expensive paper, cream-colored with elegant script addressing it to James Callahan, Callahan Ranch, Montana Territory. What chilled him wasn't the formality, but the return address: S. Blackwood, Esquire, Chicago, Illinois. "Appreciate you making the trip out, Tom," James managed, forcing his voice to remain steady. "No trouble at all. That storm kept me delayed in town for near a week. Figure folks been waiting long enough for their mail." Tom tipped his hat and spurred his horse back toward the main road. James stood in the yard, the letter feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in his hands. Through the kitchen window he could see Mara moving about, probably starting preparations for their midday meal. She'd been humming lately, soft, wordless melodies that filled the house with a warmth he'd forgotten existed, the sound of contentment. Inside, Mara looked up from the pot of stew she was stirring, her face brightening at his return. "Was that the mail? I thought I heard voices." "Yes," James said simply, setting the other letters on the table but keeping the cream-colored envelope in his hand. "Mara, we need to talk." Something in his tone made her straighten, the wooden spoon forgotten in her hand. "What is it?" James held up the letter. "This came addressed to me, but I suspect it concerns you. The return address says S. Blackwood." The color drained from Mara's face so completely that James stepped forward, afraid she might faint. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "How did he—" Her voice was barely a whisper. "How did he find me here?" "I don't know," James said gently. "Should I open it?" Mara nodded, though her entire body was trembling. James carefully tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter within. The handwriting was precise, controlled, and the words were like ice. Water in his veins. "Mr. Callahan," he read aloud, "I am informed that you may be harboring my wife, who departed Chicago without permission several months ago. The woman in question is Mrs. Silas Blackwood, and she is carrying my child. She is not well, mentally speaking, and prone to flights of fancy and delusional episodes. I am prepared to offer a substantial reward for her safe return, as well as compensation for any expenses you may have incurred in her care. She may have given you a false name, but she can be identified by her condition and her tendency toward nervous afflictions. I will be traveling west to collect her personally, and expect full cooperation from law-abiding citizens. Any attempt to conceal her whereabouts will be met with the full force of the law. Respectfully, Silas Blackwood, attorney at law." The silence that followed was deafening. Mara had sunk into a chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James felt rage building in his chest, not just at the threatening tone of the letter, but at the calculated cruelty of its contents. "Mara," he said softly, kneeling beside her chair, "look at me." She raised her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's lying about the marriage," she whispered. "There was a ceremony, but it wasn't legal. He had papers drawn up that made me his property, not his wife. And the baby—" She placed both hands protectively over her belly. "The baby isn't his. It's why I had to run. When he found out I was carrying another man's child, he said he'd make sure neither of us survived." James felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Who was the father? A good man. A gentle man who worked for my father. Silas had him killed when he discovered our relationship. Fresh tears spilled over. He said he'd do the same to the baby once it was born, that he wouldn't raise another man's bastard. But you got away. Barely. I had help, a woman who worked in the house. She told me about the westbound stage, gave me what money she could scrape together. Mara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I thought I'd gotten far enough away. I thought I was safe. James stood slowly, the letter still in his hand. You are safe. This letter changes nothing. You don't understand, Mara said desperately. He has money, influence. He can make things very difficult for you if you don't cooperate. Let him try, James said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. This is my land, and you're under my protection. No man has the right to terrorize a woman, regardless of what papers he waves around. Mara stared at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. He'll come here, and when he does, he'll find out that some things can't be bought or intimidated. James walked to the fireplace and tossed the letter into the flames, watching it curl and blacken. Let him come. The ashes of Silas's letter had barely settled when James walked to the mantelpiece and reached for something he hadn't touched in 3 years. Behind Margaret's photograph sat a wooden box, its surface worn smooth by his father's hands and his grandfather's before that. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his father's Winchester rifle, the same weapon that had protected 3 generations of Callahans on this land. Mara watched him with growing alarm as he lifted the rifle and checked its action with practiced movements. James, what are you doing? Making sure we're prepared, he said simply, running his hands along the barrel to check for rust or damage. This belonged to my father, and his father before him. Never thought I'd need it for anything but hunting. But circumstances change. You can't fight him, Mara said, rising from her chair, despite the baby's weight. You don't understand what kind of man Silas is. He doesn't just threaten, he follows through. And he has resources, connections, people who will do whatever he pays them to do. James set the rifle aside and turned to face her fully. And you don't understand what kind of man I am. I've never run from trouble, and I'm not about to start now. This isn't your trouble, Mara said desperately. I should leave, tonight, before he gets here. I can disappear again, find somewhere else. Where? James interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. Where exactly would you go, 8 months pregnant, in the middle of winter? How far do you think you'd get before the cold or exhaustion or both caught up with you? Mara wrapped her arms around herself, the gesture protective and heartbreaking. I survived before. Barely. You were half dead when I found you, remember? And that was with a stagecoach and other travelers to start with. James stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Besides, you're not just thinking about yourself anymore, are you? Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, and James saw the moment the full weight of her situation hit her. She wasn't just a woman on the run anymore. She was a mother protecting her unborn child. I won't let my problems become yours, she whispered. They already are, James said quietly. The moment I brought you into this house, the moment I decided you belonged here, your problems became mine. That's what decent people do. They stand together against those who would do harm. But why? Mara's voice broke. Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know? James was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. You know, after Margaret died, I thought my life was over. Oh, I kept breathing, kept working, kept going through the motions, but I wasn't really living. Just existing day to day, waiting for, I don't know what I was waiting for. He moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had been his whole world for so long. Then you came along. Suddenly, this house had laughter. In it again, suddenly there was someone to cook for, someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who made me remember what it felt like to have purpose beyond just surviving. Mara felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the desperate sobs that had racked her after reading Silas's letter. These carried something, warmer, more complex. You gave me back my life, James continued, turning back to her. So when some man I've never met threatens to take you away, threatens to hurt you and your child, it's not charity that makes me want to fight. It's self-preservation, because losing you now would be like dying all over again. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken feelings, with possibilities that neither of them had dared to voice before this moment. Mara studied James's face, seeing not just the gentle rancher who had saved her life, but the strong man, who was willing to risk everything to protect what mattered to him. "I need you to understand something," she said finally. "If we do this, if we stand and fight, there's no going back. Silas won't give up. Even if we win this time, he'll keep coming. Are you prepared for that kind of life?" James picked up the Winchester again, checking to make sure it was loaded. "I've been preparing for it my whole life, even if I didn't know. Yet my father taught me that a man protects what's his, and you—" He paused, the words hanging in the air between them. "You're mine to protect now, if you'll have me." It wasn't a declaration of love, exactly, but it was something deeper, a promise of commitment that transcended romance and touched something fundamental about human loyalty and protection. "Then we make our stand here," Mara said, her voice stronger than it had been since the letter arrived. "Together!" James nodded, feeling something settle into place in his chest, like a key finding its lock. Together! The days that followed took on a different quality, charged with purpose and quiet determination. James moved through his preparations with the methodical precision of a man who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. He checked every window latch, reinforced the door frames, and positioned extra ammunition in strategic locations throughout the house. Mara, despite her advancing pregnancy, insisted on helping however she could. She had surprised James with her practical knowledge, apparently growing up as a lawyer's daughter in Philadelphia, had included lessons in self-reliance that most ladies of her station never received. "My father believed women should know how to take care of themselves," she explained as she carefully cleaned and oiled his spare pistol. Her movements were confident, suggesting this wasn't her first time handling firearms. "He said you never knew when circumstances might require it." "Smart man," James observed, watching her work. "Most men think keeping women helpless keeps them safe." "Most men are fools," Mara replied with a slight smile, the first he'd seen since the letter arrived. Helplessness never protected anyone. That evening, by the warmth of the fireplace, Mara worked on something that had become her constant companion. A baby blanket she was knitting from soft wool James had purchased in town months earlier, intending it for trade. The pattern was intricate, with tiny cables that spoke of hours of patient work. Her needles clicked in a steady rhythm that had become as familiar to James as his own heartbeat. "It's beautiful," he said, watching her fingers move with practiced ease, despite the lamplight being somewhat dim. "My mother taught me," Mara said softly. "She said every baby should have something made with love to welcome them into the world." She paused, her hands stilling. "I started this the day I realized I was carrying a child, back when I believed I might have a normal life." "You will have a normal life," James said firmly. "Maybe not the one you planned, but a good one, a safe one." Mara looked up from her knitting, studying his face in the firelight. "How can you be so certain?" "Because I've seen what you're made. Of any woman who can survive what you've survived, who can keep fighting for her child against those odds, isn't going to be stopped by one mean man with more money than sense." They worked in comfortable silence after that, Mara's needles clicking steadily while James cleaned his guns and checked his supplies. The domestic scene might have looked peaceful to an outside observer, but both of them were acutely aware they were preparing for war. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Doc Peterson rode up to the house just after dawn, his medical bag secured behind his saddle and his breath visible in the cold air. "Heard you might have someone here in need of medical attention," he said without preamble, dismounting with the stiffness of a man in his 60s who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. James exchanged a look with Mara, who had appeared in the doorway at the sound of voices. "News travels fast," James said carefully. "Fast enough. Tom Bradley mentioned seeing a woman here when he delivered the mail. Figured with winter lasting as long as it has, She might need checking over. Doc Peterson was a good man, discreet and skilled, but James still felt protective of Mara's privacy. "I'm fine," Mara said, stepping onto the porch despite the cold. "Really, there's no need." "Mom, with respect, that's for me to determine," Doc Peterson said kindly but firmly. "A woman in your condition, especially after what Tom described as a stagecoach accident, needs proper medical attention." James saw the conflict in Mara's face, her instinct to avoid attention warring with her concern for her unborn child. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Doc Peterson's been delivering babies in this territory for 30 years. If anyone can help, it's him." The examination took place in the bedroom, with James waiting anxiously in the kitchen. When Doc Peterson emerged an hour later, his expression was professionally neutral. "Well?" James asked. "Baby's healthy, positioned well, mother's in good condition considering what she's been through. I'd say you've got maybe 3 weeks, maybe a month, before the little one decides to make an appearance." Doc Peterson packed his instruments carefully. "She's been through some stress, but nothing that good food and rest won't help." "Thank you," James said, relief evident in his voice. Doc Peterson paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "James, I don't know what's going on here, and I'm not asking. But if there's trouble coming, you know you've got friends in town who'll stand with you." "I appreciate that, Doc." "Sometimes a man needs to know he's not fighting alone," the old doctor said. "Remember that." After Doc Peterson left, James found Mara sitting by the window, her hands moving automatically over her knitting. The baby blanket was nearly finished. Now, its intricate pattern a testament to hours of careful work and loving attention. 3 weeks, she said softly. "Maybe 4, James reminded her. "Will it be enough time?" James looked out at the snow-covered landscape, calculating distances and travel times in his head. "It'll have to be." That night, Mara wrote in her journal, "A doctor came today and confirmed what I already knew. This child will arrive soon. James continues to prepare for trouble, and I find myself doing the same. Strange how quickly this place has become home, how naturally I've settled into the rhythm of life here. I'm making a blanket for my baby, and for the first time, I truly believe there will be a safe place for them to sleep when they arrive." Christmas Eve arrived with a crystalline silence that seemed to muffle even the whisper of wind through the pines. Snow had fallen steadily for 3 days, transforming the ranch into something from a fairy tale, all soft curves and gentle shadows. Inside the warm kitchen, Mara stood at the scarred wooden table that had become the heart of their shared life, kneading bread dough with steady, rhythmic movements. James watched her from his chair by the fire, marveling at how naturally she'd taken to the domestic rhythms of ranch life. Her movements had the unconscious grace of someone who belonged exactly where she was, even though he knew she'd grown up in drawing rooms and parlors, far from this rough frontier existence. "My grandmother's recipe," she said, noticing his attention. "She taught me before she passed. Said a woman should know how to make bread that could sustain a family through hard times." "Seems like she knew what she was talking about," James replied, breathing in the warm scent of yeast and flour that had been filling the house for the past hour. It was their first Christmas together, though neither had spoken of it directly. James had cut a small pine tree and brought it inside, setting it in the corner by the window. Mara had fashioned decorations from scraps of fabric and dried berries, creating something beautiful from the simplest materials. The tree wasn't grand, but it transformed the room into something magical. "I have something for you," James said suddenly, rising from his chair with the slightly awkward air of a man unaccustomed to gift-giving. Mara looked up from her kneading, flour dusting her hands and a strand of hair escaping from her braid. "James, you've already given me so much." "This is different," he said, disappearing into his workshop and returning with a small wooden box. "I've been working on it in the evenings." Inside the box, nestled in a bed of soft cloth, lay a simple gold band, not ornate or expensive, but beautifully crafted, the metal warm and smooth. Mara stared at it, her heart suddenly racing. I'm not proposing," James said quickly, his cheeks reddening. "Not exactly, but I was thinking, if Blackwood comes here, if there's trouble, it might be better if folks thought you were my wife. Legal protection, you understand. And the baby," he gestured toward her growing belly, "child should have a name, a legitimate place in the world." Mara lifted the ring from its box, surprised by how perfectly it fit her finger when she slipped it on. "Where did you get this?" "Made it myself. Melted down some gold coins my father left me. Figured they weren't doing anyone any good sitting in a drawer." James watched her face carefully. "It doesn't have to mean anything more than practical protection. I understand you might not. That is, I know you've been hurt, and I wouldn't want you to think I was taking advantage." "James!" Mara's voice was soft but firm, cutting through his nervous rambling. "Look at me." He met her eyes, seeing something there that made his breath catch. In the warm lamplight, with flour in her hair and her hand resting on the curve of her belly, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "This ring," she said, holding up her hand to catch the light. "It's the first gift anyone has ever given me that came with no conditions, no expectations of payment or obligation. Just kindness." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "And this table, this kitchen, this life we've been building together, it's the first place I've ever felt truly safe." She moved closer to him, her eyes never leaving his face. "So yes, I'll wear your ring. I'll be your wife, in name and in truth, if you'll have me. Not because it's practical, but because—" She reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers gentle against his skin. "Because I love you, James Callahan. I love your gentle hands and your quiet strength, and the way you make me feel like I deserve to be protected instead of owned." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning years of loneliness and hurt. James covered her hand with his own, leaning into her touch as if it were the first warmth he'd felt in years. "I love you too," he said simply. "Been afraid to say it, afraid you'd think it was too soon, or that I was just a lonely old rancher taking advantage of circumstances. But I've loved you since that first morning when you sat at my table and made this house feel like a home again." They came together naturally, his arms encircling her as carefully as if she were made of spun glass, her face tilted up to meet his. The kiss was tender, full of promise and hope, and the quiet joy of two people who had found something precious they'd thought lost forever. When they broke apart, Mara laughed softly, a sound like water over stones. "So, Mr. Callahan, what does a wife do around here on Christmas Eve?" "Well, Mrs. Callahan," James replied, the title sending warmth through his chest. "I believe she finishes her bread, shares a quiet dinner with her husband, and maybe she lets him read to her by the fire." "That sounds perfect," Mara said, turning back to her kneading with the gold band, catching the light with every movement of her hands. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the warm kitchen, a new family was taking shape, built not on legal documents or social expectations, but on choice and love, and the simple miracle of two broken people becoming whole together. February melted into March with the grudging reluctance of a Montana winter finally admitting defeat. The first signs were subtle, icicles dripping during the warmest part of the day, patches of bare ground appearing where the snow had been deepest. James noticed these changes with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 42 winters watching the seasons turn. But this year, the approaching spring carried special significance. Mara was entering her final month, her movements careful and deliberate as she navigated around the kitchen that had become her domain. The baby had dropped lower, Doc Peterson informed them during his weekly visits, and her back ached constantly, despite James's gentle massages in the evenings. Yet, there was a glow about her that had nothing to do with her pregnancy and everything to do with the contentment that had settled over their household. "Look," she said one morning, pointing through the kitchen window to where a tiny cluster of wildflowers had pushed through the last stubborn patch of snow near the porch. "First flowers of spring." James looked up from his breakfast, following her gaze to the small splash of purple against the white. Without a word, he rose from the table, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. Mara watched through the window as he carefully gathered the delicate blooms, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he avoided damaging the fragile stems. When he returned, he presented them to her with a small smile. Figured they'd look better on the table than freezing outside. It was such a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes about the man he was, someone who noticed small beauties and wanted to share them with the person he loved. Mara accepted the flowers with the same reverence. She might have shown for a bouquet of roses from the finest Philadelphia florist. "They're perfect," she said, arranging them in a small mason jar filled with water. Spring's first gift. The flowers seemed to open some floodgate of renewal around the ranch. Within days, more green shoots appeared and the sound of running water could be heard as snow began melting in earnest from the higher elevations. James spent his days checking fence lines damaged by winter storms and preparing for the spring planting, but he was never far from the house and never far from Mara. Their relationship had deepened in the weeks since Christmas into something that felt both settled and new. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of a couple married for years, yet maintained the careful tenderness of lovers still discovering each other. James would catch himself watching her as she worked, marveling at how completely she'd integrated herself into his life. Mara, for her part, found herself planning not just for the baby's arrival, but for years of shared seasons in this place that had become home. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Mara broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "Do you think he's given up, Silas?" James considered his words carefully. They'd had no word from the outside world since the threatening letter, no sign that anyone was asking questions or searching for Mara. Could be. Winter's been hard this year. Maybe he decided it wasn't worth pursuing. You don't believe that. Any more than I do, Mara said quietly, her hand resting on her belly where the baby was actively kicking. Men like Silas don't give up. They see persistence as a virtue, pursuit as a right. Then we'll be ready for him, James replied with calm certainty. We've prepared as much as we can. The rest is in God's hands. It was this quiet confidence that Mara had come to rely on, the way James approached problems with methodical preparation, followed by acceptance of what couldn't be controlled. It was so different from the frantic energy that had characterized her life before, the constant vigilance, the exhausting effort to anticipate and avoid conflict. I used to think courage meant never being afraid, she said, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. But being here with you, I've learned it means being afraid and doing what's right anyway. Fear keeps you alive, James said. Courage keeps you human. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sarah McKenna, the wife of a neighboring rancher, arrived with two other women from the small community that had grown up around the territorial settlement. They came bearing gifts for the expected baby, tiny clothes, blankets, and the kind of practical wisdom that only experienced mothers could provide. Heard you were expecting, Sarah said, with the direct manner of frontier women who didn't have time for elaborate social niceties. Figured you might appreciate some company and maybe some advice. It was Mara's first real interaction with other women since arriving at the ranch, and she found herself both nervous and grateful. These women accepted her presence without question, treating her as James's wife and a member of their small community, rather than an outsider with a mysterious past. "First baby?" asked Martha Collins, an older woman whose own children were grown and scattered across the territory. "Yes," Mara replied, then hesitated before adding, "I lost my mother when I was young. I don't really know what to expect. Birth is different for every woman," Martha said kindly, "but the love that comes after is the same. You'll know what to do when the time comes." They spent the afternoon sharing stories and practical advice, hemming tiny garments and discussing the realities of motherhood on the frontier. When they left, Mara felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the sense of belonging to a community of women who would support and protect each other. "They're good people," James said that evening, watching Mara organize the gifts they'd brought. "They treat me like I belong here," Mara said with wonder. "Like I've always belonged here." "You have," James said simply. "From the moment I found you in that snow, you belonged here." That night, Mara added a new entry to her journal. "Today, I met my neighbors, women who welcomed me without reservation, who offered friendship and support, simply because I'm carrying a child and am part of their community. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, I feel like I have a place in the world that's mine by right, rather than sufferance. Spring is coming to the land, but it's already arrived in my heart." As she wrote, the baby moved restlessly within her, and Mara found herself smiling. Soon, very soon, this child would be born into a world where they were wanted and welcomed, where they would have not just parents, but an entire community to help them grow strong and safe. The evening of March 15th brought a warmth to the air that spoke of winter's final retreat. James had spent the day in town, ostensibly to pick up supplies, but Mara suspected there was more to his trip than he'd let on. He'd been unusually quiet at breakfast, and she'd caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, nervous anticipation mixed with something deeper. When he returned just before sunset, he carried himself differently, as if he'd made some important decision during his absence. At dinner, he seemed distracted, barely touching the venison stew Mara had prepared with vegetables from their winter stores. "James, is everything all right?" she asked finally, setting down her spoon. "You've been somewhere else all evening." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the table. In the lamplight, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie sun and wind, but also the gentleness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "I need to ask you something," he said, pushing back from the table and standing. "Something important." Mara felt her heart quicken, though she couldn't say why. "What is it?" Instead of answering immediately, James walked to the mantelpiece and retrieved something from behind Margaret's photograph, a small object wrapped in soft cloth. When he returned to the table, he unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple gold band that caught the lamplight like captured fire. "This isn't the ring I gave you at Christmas," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Mara could see in his eyes. "That was for protection, for practical reasons. This—" He held up the new ring, and she could see the care that had gone into its making. "This is different." The band was wider than the one she wore, engraved with a delicate pattern of intertwining vines that seemed to flow around its circumference. It was beautiful in its simplicity, speaking of permanence and growth and things that endured. "I know we've been living as husband and wife," James continued, "and I know you wear my name and my ring. But I realized I never did this properly, never asked you the way a woman deserves to be asked." He lowered himself to one knee beside her chair, taking her left hand in both of his. The simple gold band she'd worn since Christmas caught the light, a symbol of the practical arrangement that had somehow become so much more. "Mara Ellison Callahan," he said formally, "will you marry me? Not because it's convenient or protective or practical, but because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Because you've brought light back into a life I thought was over. Because I want to spend whatever years I have left watching you raise that baby and maybe giving them brothers and sisters to grow up with." Tears had begun flowing down Mara's cheeks before he finished speaking. In all her imagining of how this moment might come, she'd never pictured such simple, honest words spoken in the kitchen that had become the heart of their shared world. "I want to build a real life with you," James continued. "Not just survival or convenience, but something lasting. I want to grow old with you, Mara. I want to see our children learn to ride and read and find their own way in the world. I want to sit on that porch when we're grey-haired and remember all the seasons we weathered together." Mara couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the completeness of what he was offering. Not just marriage, but a future filled with all the ordinary miracles she'd stopped believing she deserved. Yes, she whispered finally, then stronger. Yes, James. Yes to all of it. He slipped the new ring onto her finger beside the first one, the two bands sitting together like symbols of their journey, from necessity to choice, from protection to love, from surviving to truly living. When James rose and kissed her, it felt different from all the kisses they'd shared before. This one carried the weight of promises made and accepted, of a future consciously chosen rather than simply stumbled into. "There's one more thing," James said against her lips. "I spoke to Reverend Morrison in town today. He's willing to come out here next week to perform a proper ceremony. Small and simple, just us and a few witnesses, but legal and binding in the eyes of God and the territory." Mara pulled back to look at him, searching his face. "You thought of everything." "I wanted to do it right," he said simply. "You deserve to be married properly, not just declared so by necessity." That night, as they sat by the fire, Mara worked on the final stitches of the baby's blanket, while James read aloud from Dickens. But both of them were acutely aware of the two rings on her finger, symbols of a love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful and strong. "I never thought I'd be this happy," Mara said during a pause in the reading. "Neither did I," James replied, closing the book and pulling her closer to his side. "Makes a man almost afraid to trust it." "Then we'll trust it together," Mara said, leaning into his warmth. "Whatever comes, we'll face it as husband and wife." Outside, spring continued its steady advance across the Montana landscape, and inside their warm kitchen, two people who had found love in the midst of winter prepared to pledge their futures to each other and to the life growing within Mara's womb. The wedding dress arrived 3 days before the ceremony, delivered by Tom Bradley, along with the regular mail and a knowing smile. James had ordered it from the general store in town without telling Mara, working from careful measurements he'd taken of one of her everyday dresses while she napped. When Mara unwrapped the package, she gasped. The dress was simple, but elegant. Deep, blue wool with tiny pearl buttons and delicate embroidery around the neckline. It was practical enough for frontier life, but beautiful enough to make her feel like a bride rather than just a woman accepting necessity. "James, it's lovely," she breathed, holding the dress up against herself. "But you shouldn't have. Every woman deserves a proper wedding dress," he said, his cheeks slightly red with embarrassment. "Sarah McKenna helped me pick it out, said blue would bring out your eyes." The fact that he'd sought advice from the neighboring women, that he'd put thought and care into making this day special for her, brought tears to Mara's eyes. In her first engagement, everything had been chosen for her, decided by men who saw the wedding as a business transaction. This dress, chosen with love and consideration for her preferences, felt like freedom itself. Reverend Morrison arrived on the appointed day, a thin man with kind eyes who'd served the scattered communities of the territory for nearly 20 years. He brought with him Sarah McKenna and her husband Robert, along with Martha Collins and her husband Jim, creating a small congregation of witnesses who'd become their chosen family. The ceremony took place in the main room of the cabin, with spring, sunlight streaming through the windows and Mara's wildflowers decorating the mantelpiece. She wore the blue dress with her hair styled in a simple arrangement that Martha had helped her achieve, crowned with a few early wildflowers that James had gathered that morning. When Reverend Morrison asked James to speak his vows, he turned to face Mara fully, taking her hands in his. The words he spoke were his own, not read from a book, and they carried the weight of lived experience and hard-won wisdom. "Mara, I promise to love you not just in good times, but in the difficult ones that are sure to come. I promise to protect you and our children with my life, to provide for you with my labor, and to honor you with my faithfulness. I promise to listen when you speak, and to value your thoughts and feelings as much as my own. And I promise to build with you a life worth living, no matter what challenges we face." Mara's vows, spoken through tears of joy, were equally heartfelt. "James, I promise to love you with the same courage you've shown me is possible, I promise to stand beside you as your partner, not behind you as your burden. I promise to make our house a home filled with warmth and laughter, and to raise our children to know they are cherished. And I promise to choose you every day for all the days of my life." When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared felt different from all that had come before. Sanctified, official, and witnessed by their community. They were no longer simply two people who'd found each other in a storm, but a legally recognized family, with all the protections and responsibilities that entailed. The celebration afterward was simple, but joyful. Sarah had brought a cake made, with precious white flour and real sugar, and Robert had contributed a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. They ate and talked and laughed as the afternoon light grew golden, creating memories that would sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. "You look happy," Martha observed, finding Mara alone for a moment on the porch as the sun began to set. "I am happy," Mara replied, smoothing her hands over the blue wool of her wedding dress. "Happier than I ever thought possible. Marriage. To a good man will do that," Martha said with the wisdom of 30 years wed to her Jim. "James Callahan's as fine a man as you'll find in this territory. You chose well. He chose me," Mara corrected gently. "Out of the snow, out of desperation, out of a life I thought would kill me, I'm the fortunate one." That night, after their guests had departed, James and Mara sat by their fire as husband and wife in truth as well as name. The blue dress hung carefully in the wardrobe, a symbol of new beginnings and conscious choice. In her jewelry box lay the 2 rings she now wore, the first representing protection and practicality, the second representing love, freely given and gladly received. "Mrs. Callahan," James said softly, testing the sound of her new name. "Mr. Callahan," she replied with a smile, settling against his side. "How does it feel to be a married man again?" "Different than before," he said thoughtfully. "Margaret and I, we grew up together, became adults together. With you, it feels like we're both bringing our full selves to this marriage. All our experiences, good and bad, everything that made us who we are. Is that better or worse?" Mara asked. "Better," James said without hesitation. "Much better." As if in response to their conversation, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, making them both laugh. "Someone wants to be part of the conversation," Mara said, rubbing the spot where tiny feet had made their presence. "Known. Won't be long now," James said, placing his hand over hers. "Our first child as a married couple." "The first of many, I hope," Mara said, then blushed at her own boldness. "As many as you want," James agreed, kissing the top of her head. "We've got time to build something beautiful together." Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, but inside their warm cabin, Mr. and Mrs. Callahan planned for a future filled with love and children, and all the ordinary miracles that make a life worth living. The honeymoon period lasted exactly 5 days. On the morning of March 28th, as Mara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she felt the first real contraction ripple across her belly. It was different from the false pain she'd been experiencing for weeks. Deeper, more purposeful, unmistakably the beginning of labor. She managed to finish hanging James's shirts before the next wave hit, this one strong enough to make her grip. The clothesline for support. The baby was coming, and based on the intensity of the contractions, coming soon. "James," she called, her voice carrying across the yard to where he was repairing a section of fence damaged by the spring thaw. He was beside her in moments, his face immediately shifting from concern to focused determination when he saw her expression. "How long?" he asked simply. "First one was maybe 10 minutes ago. This one was stronger." As if to prove her point, another contraction gripped her, and James supported her weight as she breathed through it. "We need to get you inside," he said, but Mara was looking toward the main road with a frown. "James, do you see that?" She pointed to a distant cloud of dust rising from the direction of town. "Riders, moving fast." James squinted against the morning sun, his blood running cold as he made out the shapes of several horsemen approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. "How many can you count?" "4, maybe 5. Another contraction hit and Mara doubled over with a gasp of pain. "James, I can't. Not now." "Yes, you can," he said firmly, helping her toward the house. "We've prepared for this. Both of this." He got her settled in the bedroom, then moved quickly to position his rifle near the window where he could watch the approaching riders. The telegram had arrived that morning with Tom Bradley's regular delivery, though neither James nor Mara had had time to read it yet. Now James tore it open with growing dread. S. Blackwood and Associates departed Denver 3 days ago, believed headed your direction. Exercise extreme caution. Sheriff Morrison. "It's him," James said grimly, showing Mara the telegram. "Blackwood's coming, and he's brought help." Mara was gripping the bedpost as another contraction peaked, her face pale but determined. How long do we have?" James calculated quickly. If they'd left Denver 3 days ago and were pushing hard, they could arrive any time. The dust cloud was getting closer, and he could now make out individual riders, 5 men on horseback, moving with the kind of purpose that meant trouble. "Maybe an hour," he said, "maybe less." Working with the efficiency born of desperate necessity, James began implementing the preparations they'd made over the long winter months. He loaded every weapon in the house and positioned ammunition where it could be easily reached. He barricaded the back door and ensured the front was secure, except for the small firing ports he'd cut in the shutters months earlier. In the bedroom, Mara was trying to time her contractions while preparing for siege. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Their child was choosing to enter the world at the exact moment when that world was about to become dangerous. "The baby's not waiting," Mara said through gritted teeth as another wave of pain crashed over her. "These contractions are coming faster." James looked out the window again. The riders had stopped about a mile away, just visible through the trees. They appeared to be setting up some kind of camp, which suggested they planned to wait rather than attack immediately. It was a tactical decision that spoke of military or law enforcement experience. Surround the target, cut off escape routes, then negotiate from a position of strength. "Smart," James muttered. "They know we're trapped." Rifle shot echoed across the valley, but the bullet went wide, striking a fence post 50 yards from the house. It was a warning shot, designed to announce their presence and intentions without causing immediate harm. "Callahan!" The voice that followed carried clearly across the distance, cultured and commanding. "I know you can hear me. I want to talk." James positioned himself at the window, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. "What do you want, Blackwood?" "I want what belongs to me," came the reply. "Send out my wife and child, and we can settle this peacefully." "She's not your wife," James shouted back. "She's mine, legally married and protected by territorial law." A harsh laugh carried across the valley. "You think some frontier preacher's words matter against legal documents drawn up in Chicago? That woman is my property, and the child she carries is mine by right of ownership." The casual way he spoke of owning another human being made James's blood boil, but he kept his voice level. "This is Montana territory, not Illinois. Your Chicago papers don't mean anything here. We'll see about that. I've got papers signed by a federal judge saying otherwise, and I've got enough men to enforce those papers, whether you cooperate or not." In the bedroom, Mara was breathing heavily through another contraction, her hands gripping the quilt James's grandmother had made. "James," she called softly, "I need you to promise me something." He moved to her side, keeping one eye on the window. "Anything. If something happens to me, if the birth goes wrong, or if Silas—" She couldn't finish the thought, but James understood. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said firmly. "I won't let it. Promise me you'll protect the baby, no matter what. Else happens, don't let him take our child." The possessive pronoun wasn't lost on James. Their child, not hers alone. Even in the midst of labor and mortal danger, she was claiming him as the father, choosing him as the parent she trusted to raise her baby if she couldn't. "I promise," he said solemnly, "but you're going to be fine. Both of you are going to be fine." Another shout from outside. "You've got 1 hour to think about it, Callahan. Then we're coming in, whether you cooperate or not." James checked his weapons one more time, then returned to Mara's side. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from Blackwood's camp. They were settling in for a siege, confident in their superior numbers and legal position, but they didn't know James Callahan, and they didn't understand that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. The snow began falling again just after noon, heavy flakes that blurred the landscape, and muffled sound. James watched from the bedroom window as Silas Blackwood's men huddled around their fire, cursing the weather that was making their siege more miserable by the hour. Inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was building. Mara's labor had progressed with frightening intensity, each contraction stronger than the last. She gripped James's hand so tightly he could feel her nails drawing blood, but he didn't pull away. Her face was pale with exhaustion, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air. "I can see the head," James said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. He'd delivered enough foals and calves to understand the process, but this was different. This was the woman he loved bringing their child into a world under siege. "Something's wrong," Mara gasped between contractions. "It's taking too long. The baby should have come by now." James examined her as gently as possible, his heart sinking as he realized the problem. The baby was positioned wrong, not breech, but turned slightly, making the delivery more difficult and dangerous for both mother and child. "The baby's just turned a little," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I need to help guide them out. It's going to hurt, but I can do this." Outside, another warning shot echoed across the valley. Blackwood was growing impatient, but James couldn't spare any attention for the threat. All his focus was on Mara and the life struggling to enter the world. "On the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can," James instructed. "I'm going to try to turn the baby as you push." Mara nodded, her jaw set with determination. When the next wave of pain hit, she bore down with everything she had, while James worked with careful, practiced hands. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly the baby's shoulder slipped free, and the rest followed in a rush. The cry that filled the room was strong and indignant, the sound of a healthy child announcing their arrival to the world. James lifted the baby, a girl, perfect and beautiful, and placed her on Mara's chest. "She's perfect," Mara sobbed, her exhaustion forgotten as she looked down at her daughter. "Oh, James, she's perfect." The baby had Mara's dark hair and what appeared to be James's strong jaw, though it was hard to tell through the wrinkled features of the newly born. What was unmistakable was the strength of her cry, and the way she immediately began rooting for food. "What do we call her?" James asked, using his knife to cut the cord, and then wrapping both mother and child in clean blankets. "Hope," Mara said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." It was perfect. This child born in the midst of danger and uncertainty, representing everything they were fighting to protect and preserve. James felt something shift in his chest, a fierce protectiveness that went beyond anything he'd ever experienced. "Hope Callahan," he said softly, testing the name. "Welcome to the world, little one." But their moment of peace was shattered by a shout from outside. "Time's up, Callahan. We're coming in." James could see the men mounting their horses, preparing for their final approach. The snow was falling harder now, which would provide some cover, but also make defense more difficult. "Mara, I need you to take Hope and get into the root cellar," he said, helping her sit up despite her weakness. "There's a hidden door behind the pantry shelves, you remember?" "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," Mara protested, even as she cradled Hope protectively. "You're not leaving me. You're protecting our daughter." James kissed her forehead, then Hope's tiny head. "This is what fathers do. We protect our families. And this is what mothers do. They keep our children safe." With great effort, Mara stood and made her way to the kitchen, Hope wrapped securely in her arms. James helped her move the pantry shelves that concealed the entrance to the underground storage area he'd dug years earlier for storing root vegetables through the winter. "Whatever happens, don't come out until you're sure it's safe," James instructed. "If something happens to me, wait until morning and then try to make it to the McKenna place." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Mara said fiercely. "You're going to win this fight and come back to us." As she disappeared into the hidden cellar with their newborn daughter, James replaced the shelves and scattered flour across the floor to hide any evidence of the concealed entrance. Then he returned to his post at the front window, rifle in hand. The riders were approaching now, 5 dark shapes moving through the swirling snow. At their head rode a tall man in an expensive coat, Silas Blackwood, come to reclaim what he considered his property. But he was about to learn that some things couldn't be owned, and some men wouldn't be intimidated, no matter the odds. Silas Blackwood dismounted, with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Even through the swirling snow, James could see the expensive cut of his clothes, the polished boots, the way he carried himself like someone who'd never been told no and expected that streak to continue. He was younger than James had expected. Perhaps 35, with the kind of sharp-featured handsomeness that probably impressed naive young women from good families. Behind him, 4 hired guns spread out in a practiced formation. These weren't local toughs or desperate men looking for quick money. They moved with military precision, and James could see the quality of their weapons and gear. Blackwood had come prepared for serious resistance. "Callahan!" Silas called out, his voice carrying clearly despite the weather. "I know you can see me. Let's discuss this like civilized men." James positioned himself at the front window, rifle aimed but not yet visible to the men outside. "Nothing to discuss, Blackwood. You're trespassing on my land. I suggest you move." "Along!" Silas laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "Your land, your woman, you really don't understand the situation, do you?" He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, holding it up so James could see. "I have legal documents here that say otherwise. Federal papers that supersede any territorial nonsense you might wave around. I don't care what your papers say," James replied. "Mara is my wife, legally married before God and witnesses. Your Chicago papers don't mean anything here." "Mara?" Silas's voice took on a mocking tone. "Is that what she's calling herself now? Her real name is Mary Blackwood, and she is my legal wife under Illinois law. Any ceremony you might have performed is invalid and meaningless." James felt cold anger building in his chest. The casual way Silas spoke about Mara, as if she were property to be reclaimed rather than a human being with rights and feelings, confirmed everything she'd told him about her former life. "Even if that were true," James said, "which it's not. She's free to choose where she wants to live and who she wants to be with. This is America, not some feudal kingdom where you can own people." Silas's expression darkened. "She's carrying my child, you ignorant frontier fool. That gives me rights that no territorial judge can take away." "The child isn't yours," James said flatly. "And even if it were, that wouldn't give you the right to terrorize its mother." "Not mine." Silas's voice rose with genuine surprise, then shifted to cruel amusement. "Oh, this is rich. She didn't tell you the truth, did she? About why she really had to run?" James felt a flicker of uncertainty but pushed it aside. Whatever game Silas was playing, whatever lies he was telling, James knew Mara. He knew her heart, her character, her genuine love for him and their life together. "I know everything I need to know," James said firmly. "Do you? Do you know she was my wife for 5 years? Do you know she lived in my house, spent my money, shared my bed? Do you know she stole from me when she left? Jewelry, cash, documents that belonged to me." Silas's voice was gaining momentum now, fueled by righteous indignation. "She's a thief and a runaway wife, and you're harboring stolen property." "She's not property," James repeated, his voice hard as granite. "And I don't care what she took from you." A woman fleeing for her life has the right to whatever she needs to survive. Silas gestured to his men, who began moving to surround the cabin. This conversation is over. You have 1 minute to send her out, or we're coming in after her. Come. Ahead, James said quietly. See what happens. Through the window, he watched Silas's face change as the man realized that threats and legal documents weren't going to be enough. This was going to require violence, and despite his hired guns and superior numbers, Silas was clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of actual bloodshed. You're making a mistake, Callahan. I have the law on my side. I have federal marshals backing my claim. If you resist, you'll be fighting the United States government. No, James said, checking his rifle one more time. I'll be fighting a man who thinks he can own another human being, and that's a fight I'm willing to have. Behind the cabin, he could hear the sound of boots crunching through snow as Silas's men moved to their positions. In a few moments, the talking would be over and the shooting would begin. But in the hidden cellar beneath the kitchen floor, Mara held their newborn daughter and listened to every word. And what she heard in James's voice wasn't just determination or courage. It was love. Pure, uncomplicated love that was willing to face any danger to protect what mattered most. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, Hope Callahan would grow up knowing that her father had been willing to die for her and her mother. That was a legacy worth fighting for. The silence that followed James's defiant words stretched taut as a bowstring. Snow continued to fall, each flake drifting down, like a witness to the confrontation about to unfold. James could feel his heart beating steadily in his chest, the familiar calm that had always come over him in moments of crisis settling into his bones. From the cellar beneath the kitchen floor, he could hear nothing. Not a cry from Hope, not a whisper from Mara. She was keeping their daughter quiet through sheer force of will, understanding that their lives depended on remaining hidden until this was over. Silas stood in the center of the yard, his expensive coat already dusted with snow, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He wasn't accustomed to being denied, and the experience was clearly unsettling him, but his hired guns remained professional, patient, waiting for orders. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Callahan," Silas called out, trying one more time to assert control through words rather than violence. "I'm offering you a way out of this. Compensation for your trouble, safe passage away from here. All I want is what belongs to me." James had positioned himself where he could see most of the yard through the front window, but he knew at least one of Silas's men would be circling around back. The cabin's defenses were good but not perfect, and 5 against 1 were long odds, no matter how well prepared he was. "Last chance," James replied, his voice carrying clearly through the falling snow. "Take your men and ride out. Nobody has to get hurt here." Silas's laugh was harsh. "Nobody has to get hurt? You're alone in there? Outnumbered 5 to 1, and you're offering me terms. You really are a fool." That's when James heard the sound that changed everything, the distant thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast from the direction of town. Through the snow, he could make out shapes moving toward the ranch at a gallop. Too many shapes to be casual visitors. Silas heard it too, his head snapping around toward the sound. "What? Who is that?" The riders emerged from the snow like cavalry. Coming to the rescue, Robert McKenna led the charge, followed by Jim Collins, Doc Peterson, and what looked like half the men from the surrounding ranches. They rode hard, rifles visible in their hands, faces grim with purpose. "Looks like the odds just changed," James called out, allowing himself a small smile. Sarah McKenna had done more than just help James pick out a wedding dress. She'd spent the week since the wedding, quietly spreading word among the community about the situation, preparing the neighbors for the possibility that one of their own might need help. When the riders had been spotted approaching the ranch, Tom Bradley had spread the alarm, and the response had been immediate. Silas's men shifted nervously, their confident formation wavering as they realized they were now outnumbered. What had Seemed like a simple retrieval operation was suddenly looking like a potential massacre. "Hold your positions!" Silas barked, but James could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Robert McKenna rode straight up to Silas, his rifle held casually but ready. Behind him, the other ranchers spread out in a loose semicircle, effectively surrounding Blackwood's men. "You boys seem to be lost," Robert said conversationally. "This is private property, and we don't take kindly to armed men threatening our neighbors." "This is none of your concern," Silas replied, trying to maintain his authority. "I have legal papers." "Don't care about your papers," Jim Collins interrupted. "Care about the fact that you're pointing guns at a good man's home. That's something we take personal around here." Doc Peterson spurred his horse closer, his medical bag visible, behind his saddle alongside his rifle. "Heard tell there might be a new baby in that house. Seems like a poor time to be making noise and threatening folks." The standoff stretched out, snow falling heavier now, dusting the shoulders of 20 men with weapons drawn. James could feel the tension like electricity in the air, knowing that one wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, could turn this into a bloodbath. "This isn't over, Callahan," Silas called out, his voice carrying a note of desperate anger. "I have the law on my side. I'll be back with federal marshals, and then you'll find the same reception waiting for you," Robert McKenna said. Firmly, "We protect our own out here. That's not going to change because you wave some papers around." For a long moment, Silas stared at the cabin where James waited, his face twisted with frustration and rage. Then, seeming to realize that this wasn't a fight he could win today, he jerked his head toward his men. "Mount up," he ordered tersely. "We're leaving." But as his men began to comply, Silas pulled something from his coat, a small, silver-framed photograph. He held it up so James could see it through the window. "Take a good look, Callahan," he shouted. "That's my wife on our wedding day. 5 years ago, legally married in Cook County, Illinois. I have witnesses, I have documents, and I have the law. This isn't over, not by a long shot." He threw the photograph into the snow and mounted his horse, spurring it hard as he led his men away from the ranch. But James could see in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, that this was a tactical retreat, not a surrender. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, James finally allowed himself to breathe. But even as relief flooded through him, he knew Silas was right about one thing. This wasn't over. The photograph lay face down in the trampled snow where Silas had thrown it, slowly being covered by the continuing fall of white flakes. James didn't retrieve it immediately. There would be time for that later, time to examine whatever evidence Silas thought would prove his claim. Right now, what mattered was making sure Mara and Hope were safe and preparing for what was surely coming next. Robert McKenna dismounted and approached the cabin, his rifle still in hand, but pointed safely toward the ground. "James, you and yours, all right in there?" "We're fine, Robert. More than fine, actually." James opened the front door, stepping onto the porch. "Mara gave birth this morning. We have a daughter." The announcement brought grins to the faces of the assembled men, and Doc Peterson immediately stepped forward. "Best let me take a look at mother and baby. Make sure everything's as it should be." James led them into the kitchen, then carefully moved the pantry shelves to reveal the hidden cellar entrance. "Mara, it's safe now. Doc Peterson's here." Mara emerged slowly, Hope cradled in her arms, blinking in the sudden light after hours in the dark cellar. She looked exhausted but determined, her hair disheveled, but her eyes bright with fierce maternal protectiveness. "Oh my," Sarah McKenna breathed, having arrived with the second wave of neighbors. "She's beautiful, just beautiful." Doc Peterson conducted his examination with gentle efficiency, pronouncing both mother and baby in excellent health despite the unusual circumstances of the birth. "Strong heartbeat, good color, latching well," he reported. "You did fine work here, James. Fine work indeed." As the immediate medical concerns were addressed, the men gathered around the kitchen table to discuss strategy. Robert McKenna, who'd served as a sergeant during the Indian Wars, took natural leadership of the planning. "Blackwood's not going to give up," he said grimly. "Man like that, with his pride wounded and his authority challenged, he'll be back. Question is when and with how many." He mentioned federal marshals, James said. Could he really get official backing for this? Doc Peterson, who'd spent years navigating territorial politics, shook his head. Doubtful. Federal marshals have better things to do than chase down runaway wives, even if his papers are legitimate. But he could hire men and claim they're acting under federal authority. Out here, who's to know the difference until it's too late? Jim Collins had been examining the photograph that James had finally retrieved from the snow. The image was water-damaged but still visible, a formal wedding portrait showing a younger Mara in an elaborate white dress standing beside Silas in front of what appeared to be a large church. "This proves they were married," Jim said quietly. "Least it proves some kind of ceremony took place." Mara took the photograph with shaking hands, staring down at the image of herself from 5 years earlier. "I was 17, she said softly. "My father owed Silas money, gambling debts. This was how he chose to pay them." "Arranged marriage?" Sarah asked with sympathy. "Purchased marriage," Mara corrected bitterly. "I was told I was saving my family from financial ruin, that it was my duty as a daughter. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to until it was too late." Robert studied the photograph more carefully. "This church, I recognize it. St. Mary's in Chicago, big Catholic church. If this was a real ceremony, it wasn't," Mara said, firmly. "Oh, the words were spoken and papers were signed, but the priest was paid to overlook certain legalities. I was underage, coerced, and there were no proper bans posted. Silas wanted the appearance of legitimacy without the inconvenience of actual law." James felt relief flood through him. "So our marriage is legitimate? More legitimate than his ever was," Doc Peterson confirmed. "You're both adults. You both consented freely, and you were married by a duly ordained minister with proper witnesses. Territorially speaking, you're as married gets." But Robert remained concerned about the practical realities. Legal or not, if Blackwood comes back with enough guns, it won't matter what papers anyone has. We need to be ready for a real fight. They spent the next hour planning defenses. The ranch's position was good. Clear fields of fire in most directions, good water supply, and multiple escape routes if retreat became necessary. But it wasn't a fortress, and determined attackers with superior numbers could eventually overcome any defense. "We need to think about getting you folks to safety," Robert suggested. "My ranch has better defensive positions and—" "No," James interrupted firmly. "This is our home. This is where we make our stand." "James," Mara said softly, shifting hope to her other arm, "maybe we should consider—" "Consider what? Running for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulders, never knowing when he might catch up again?" James shook his head. "Our daughter deserves better than that. She deserves a home where she can grow up safe and free." Mara looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully despite the tension filling the room. By the kitchen window sat the loaded shotgun James had positioned there weeks earlier, a reminder that sometimes peace required the willingness to fight for it. "Then we stay," she said finally. "We stay and we fight." Robert nodded approvingly. "In that case, we'd better get serious about preparations. If Blackwood's coming back, he'll probably bring more men and better weapons. We need to be ready." As the men began detailed planning for the defense of the ranch, Mara sat in her rocking chair by the fire, nursing Hope and listening to the quiet voices discussing positions and ammunition and fields of fire. It wasn't the peaceful beginning to motherhood she'd imagined, but it was theirs, this life they'd chosen, this family they'd built, this home they were prepared to defend with their lives. They came at dawn 3 days later, riding hard through the morning mist like specters from a nightmare. This time, Silas had brought 12 men, professional gunfighters with cold eyes and worn weapons who moved with the easy confidence of those accustomed to violence. They spread out in a wide semicircle around the ranch, cutting off all escape routes with military precision. James watched from the reinforced front window as Silas dismounted in the center of the yard. The man looked different now. Harder, more dangerous, his expensive clothes replaced with practical riding gear and a gun belt that showed signs of regular use. Whatever restraint had held him back during their first encounter was gone. Callahan. Silas's voice carried clearly across the frosty morning air. I told you I'd be back. This time there's no negotiating. Send out my wife and child, or we'll come in and take them. She's not your wife, James called back, checking his rifle one final time. Around the house, he could see Robert McKenna and the other neighbors in their prepared positions. They'd spent 3 days turning the ranch into a fortress, and now it was time to see if their preparations would be enough. I have federal warrants, Silas shouted, waving papers in the air. Legal documents that supersede any territorial authority. You're harboring a fugitive, Callahan, and that makes you a criminal too. From the bedroom where she was hidden with Opamara could hear every word. The baby was nursing quietly, seemingly oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Mara had insisted on staying in the house rather than hiding in the cellar again. If this was going to be their final stand, she wanted to be where she could help if needed. Your papers don't mean anything here, James replied. Mara is my wife. Legally married under territorial law. That child is my daughter, born in my house on my land. If you want them, you'll have to go through me. Silas's face twisted with rage. Fine. Have it your way. The first shot came from one of Silas's men, positioned behind the barn, a rifle bullet that splintered the window frame inches from James's head. He ducked and returned fire, his shot taking the gunman in the shoulder and spinning him around. The battle erupted in earnest then, gunfire crackling across the ranch yard like deadly fireworks. James had positioned himself to cover the front approach while Robert McKenna and Jim Collins defended the sides of the house. The plan was simple. Hold them off long enough for help to arrive, or until Silas realized the cost was too high. But Silas had learned from his first defeat. These weren't local toughs impressed by superior numbers. These were professional killers who advanced under covering fire, using the ranch buildings as shelter while they closed the distance to the house. A window exploded inward as a gunman reached the side porch, spraying glass across the kitchen floor. James spun and fired, catching the man-center mass before he could climb through the opening. But even as that threat ended, another began. Smoke was rising from the direction of the barn. They're trying to burn us out, James muttered, realizing the tactical brilliance of the move. Fire would force them from their defensive positions, making them easy targets for the waiting gunmen. In the bedroom, Mara heard the gunfire intensifying and made a decision that would have terrified her weeks earlier, but now seemed natural. She settled hope in the cradle James had made, ensuring she was safely positioned away from any windows, then picked up the loaded pistol he'd left for her protection. The front door exploded inward under the impact of multiple rifle shots, the reinforced wood splintering but holding. James could see Silas himself advancing now, a pistol in each hand, his face twisted with rage and determination. "You can't have them!" James shouted, emerging from cover to face Silas directly. "They're mine to protect." "Nothing is yours," Silas screamed back, raising both pistols. "Everything you think you have, I can take away." The two men faced each other across the shattered kitchen, weapons drawn, the culmination of weeks of building tension finally reached. Behind Silas, his remaining men were advancing, but James only had eyes for the man who'd terrorized the woman he loved. They fired simultaneously, 2 shots echoing as one in the confined space. Silas's bullet went wide, thrown off by his rage and haste. James's shot was true, catching Silas in the chest and driving him backward against the kitchen table. But even as Silas fell, one of his men appeared in the doorway, rifle raised and aimed at James's back. It was Mara who ended that threat, stepping out of the bedroom with her pistol steady in both hands, firing once and watching the gunman crumple. In the sudden silence that followed, James could hear Silas's labored breathing. The man was dying, blood spreading across his expensive shirt, but his eyes were still fixed on James with undiminished hatred. You think you've won," Silas gasped. But there will always be others. Men with power, men who take what they want, maybe. James said quietly, kneeling beside the dying man. But not today, and not from my family. Silas's eyes closed for the final time, just as Hope began crying from the bedroom, the sound of new life replacing the echo of death in the small house that had become a battleground. 6 months later, the Montana summer had transformed the ranch into something from a dream. Where snow had once blanketed the fields, wildflowers now painted the landscape in brilliant purples and golds. The garden Mara had planted in the spring was flourishing, heavy with vegetables that would see them through another winter. But this time, that prospect held no fear, only the quiet satisfaction of a life built on solid ground. Hope Callahan gurgled contentedly in her father's arms as James walked the perimeter of their property, checking fences with the methodical care of a man who understood that safety lay in attention to details. At 6 months old, she was a beautiful baby with Mara's dark eyes and James's steady temperament, already showing signs of the quiet strength that would serve her well in this frontier life. "There's my 2 favorite people," Mara called from the porch, where she was hanging out the tiny white christening gown that had arrived that morning, a gift from James's sister in Denver, who was planning to visit for the ceremony next week. The christening gown represented everything they'd fought to achieve: legitimacy, community acceptance, and the right to raise their daughter in peace. Reverend Morrison would perform the ceremony with half the territory's families in attendance. Hope would be welcomed into the community as the beloved daughter of James and Mara Callahan, with no questions asked about her parentage or her parents. "Complicated past. She's getting heavy," James said with pride, settling Hope against his shoulder as she dozed in the warm afternoon sun. "Won't be long before she's walking, getting into everything. Good thing we'll have help keeping an eye on her," Mara replied, one hand resting unconsciously on her still flat belly. They hadn't announced it yet, but she was fairly certain she was carrying their second child, a baby conceived in love and joy rather than desperation and fear. The legal troubles had been resolved more easily than expected. Silas's federal warrants had turned out to be forgeries, and his hired gunmen had scattered after his death, more interested in self-preservation than revenge. The territorial authorities had ruled the entire incident a clear case of self-defense, and the community's testimony about Silas's threats had made James and Mara local heroes rather than suspected criminals. Doc Peterson rode up just as they were settling down for their afternoon rest, his familiar medical bag secured behind his saddle. These weren't emergency visits anymore. He'd taken to stopping by regularly, drawn as much by Mara's excellent coffee and James's willingness to discuss books as by his professional obligations. "How's our little frontier princess today?" he asked, dismounting with the careful movements of a man feeling his years. "Perfect as always," James replied, though he handed Hope over for Doc Peterson's weekly examination, with the caution of a new father who still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. As the old doctor pronounced Hope healthy and thriving, Mara looked out across the fields where their neighbors' children were already playing, imagining the day when Hope would join them, running through the wildflowers, learning to ride, growing up free and safe and loved. "You know," Doc Peterson said as he prepared to leave, "I've delivered a lot of babies in my time, but I don't think I've ever seen one welcomed into a happier home." After he left, James and Mara sat on their porch as the sun began to set. Hope, sleeping peacefully between them in the cradle that had survived the gunfight without a scratch. The christening gown fluttered gently in the evening breeze, white as hope itself against the endless Montana sky. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Mara asked softly. "If that storm hadn't forced me off the stagecoach route, if you hadn't found me in the snow?" James considered the question seriously, as he considered all her questions. "I think about how close we came to missing each other," he said finally. "How easily this happiness might never have existed. It makes me grateful for every ordinary A day we get to share. In the distance, the first stars were beginning to appear, and inside their warm home, a family that had been forged in crisis was now free to grow in peace.